everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Albums Only podcast, episode number 21. My name is Jacob Slater. With me, as always, is Alan Beavers. Today we're covering a band that's very close to my heart, perhaps one of my favorite bands of all time, Black Sabbath. And we're covering their first album ever, their self-titled album, in fact, released in 1970. And obviously I'm a big fan of this band. Enjoyed them for years. And there's a lot of history there to talk about, not only of the band itself, but also the fact that Black Sabbath pretty much kickstarted an entire genre of music, heavy metal music, which has grown into its very own huge thing. So there's going to be a lot to talk about there besides just the album itself. So first thing that we usually like to do is ask ourselves, where did you first become familiar with Black Sabbath? And I'm directing that towards you, Alan, since you're the only other person here. Where did you first discover Black Sabbath?
Yeah, Jacob, I mean, that's the perennial question that we always ask each other is, where did you first hear Black Sabbath? And for me, I mean, I grew up pretty sheltered. And so I don't remember where exactly I first heard of Black Sabbath, but it was sort of a no-no. I didn't grow up with a particularly religious family or anything like that. I just grew up kind of sheltered away from the world in many aspects. And so I don't remember where I first heard Black Sabbath, but by the time I was 15 or 16, I become familiar with Black Sabbath, and I was sort of under the impression, which is sort of the very basic unknowing perception, that Black Sabbath might somehow be bad, but I didn't fully understand how or why they would be bad. And it's sort of that, not that they weren't good, it's just that, like, the sort of, like, it's a forbidden thing to listen to Black Sabbath in a way. But as I got older, I began to understand what it was, and that that Black Sabbath was, when they sang and what they were doing was with a wink and a nod. And I think that's really important for people to know. And by the time I was 19 years old, I went to my first Ozfest in Columbus, Ohio. So I was familiar with Black Sabbath, and I liked Black Sabbath. I mean, I was really, Paranoid was the album that I was really broke in on, and I really enjoyed. But yeah, for me, Black Sabbath, can't remember where exactly I first heard them, but it was sort of that, the sort of the no-no thing, and until I got older and realized that, oh, there's nothing here that's bad. It's all the sort of satanic underpinnings, quote unquote, are really there just to be that tempting, the other side to Christian music, or the other side of any sort of duality, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed Black Sabbath. I thought they were really heavy and really good once I could get into it. It seems to me like you're gonna have a good story about this. I'm hoping you do. Do you remember when you first heard Black Sabbath?
I might have heard it before the moment I'm thinking of, but the first moment I can really clearly remember knowing a Black Sabbath song was from Guitar Hero. I've mentioned Guitar Hero so many times that I think Harmonix owes me back pay at this point.
They don't have it. They're struggling a little bit right now.
But first Guitar Hero game, which came out for the PlayStation 2, one of the first songs you get to play on that game is Iron Man by Black Sabbath. And the first time I heard that, it was, I don't know, I guess you'd say it was transformative. Originally, like, my first taste of classic rock, I guess you would say, and rock music in general, was through Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, although he's definitely a fantastic rock musician, his music was always lighter to me. It was brighter, had a lot of energy and life to it. And then I hear Iron Man, which it's as heavy as Jimi Hendrix's stuff, but it's definitely not what Jimi Hendrix was doing. It's dark, it's dangerous in a lot of ways. The riff of Iron Man hits you like cannonballs to the chest. And I think I fell in love with the band at that moment.
And how old were you again?
Not sure when Guitar Hero came out, but I was probably like early high school or middle school age, I would say.
So we're looking at like 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there.
Yeah, right around that time. I was also kind of late to the party when it comes to rock music, as I've mentioned before.
Yeah, I think I was too, but I think it's important to mention this age thing because what's so fascinating to me is that age, the age that I've mentioned and that you've mentioned, right around that age, those teenage years and even into your lower 20s, everything's new. Like everything is so new and so fascinating and you become immersed in things because if you really want to set out to discover things, it's there for you at that age. And I kind of miss that. Because everything now to me is like, okay, that sounds like this or this and that. So at that age, it's fascinating for me to hear people talk about discovering things in their teens because everything is so new and it's so enthralling. It's its own unique period in life. When you're living in the moment, you don't realize how important your teens are for things like that, for discovery. It's the best part about being a teenager, I think. I'm sorry to diverge there, but it's a point that I just wanted to get out. But yeah, I think in Guitar Hero, I mean, again, I've said it before, it's so really important to a lot of people our age and music that we've come across in the discovery of music. So
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think about now, but even in like the mid-2000s, there was still this kind of, the internet still seemed kind of like a wild frontier in a lot of ways. Like there was still, you still kind of had to dig to find music, I think, in a lot of ways. It wasn't, you could just instantly go to like SoundCloud, a whole bunch of other sites that now stream music. It was still kind of a newer thing.
well, and you had your LimeWire or Kazaa, or if you were at the very infancy, Napster, or I'm sure there's probably even a forerunner to that I'm not aware of. But yeah, you did, and you didn't. I think things were often attributed to the wrong person. I mean, I can't tell you how many times. I think we had talked about this before. Certain songs are attributed to... A lot of songs were attributed to Tom Petty that Tom Petty never sang, by the way. I'm sure that's a big one.
Telling you how old I am. My first experience buying Black Sabbath music was through CDs. I actually had my first Black Sabbath album was the Greatest Hits collection, We Sold Our Soul for Rock and Roll, which is a great title, by the way. That is a fantastic title. Only kind of learned while doing research for this episode that apparently this was put out without the band's consent by Warner Brothers. So an album that was like very kind of influential to me growing up was also one that the band wished didn't exist. And I kind of wish I still had it now. I think I sold it to buy more CDs when I was younger, and I don't have it anymore. And I then eventually got into the other albums in Sabbath's discography, and really, when you get down to it, Black Sabbath is probably the band that has informed me as like a music consumer ever since. Because, I was a weird kid, you liked weird stuff, and Black Sabbath was a weird band, sang about weird stuff, and it kind of got me in the right mindset to just continue to consume weird music.
Yeah, and never the two shall part. Once you two met up, it was over.
Yeah, I was done for. I haven't listened to all of Black Sabbath's discography. I want to disclaimer that right out of the gate. So I'm not what you'd call a Black Sabbath expert, but I do really love the group, and I especially love their earlier albums.
So do we want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the band itself? I think that'd be a good place to transition to. You are tasked with the wonderful duty of doing that for us. So tell us a little bit about Black Sabbath, the origins, and we'll talk a little bit about the discography and the history all wrapped in one before we actually talk about the debut album.
Yeah, and it's not really going to be a little. The band that would eventually become known as Black Sabbath formed when Tony Iommi and Bill Ward, who previously played in a group called Mythology, escaped from that band and joined up with Geezer Butler and Ozzy Osbourne, who were coming from a band known as Rare Breed. They kind of discovered each other when Iommi noticed a window advertisement that he was passing by that said, Ozzy Zig needs gig, has own PA, which, that's really how you get a band started, I think, is you tempt people with free equipment. The band originally was called the Polka Tulk Blues Band, which was named after a brand of talcum powder, which was eventually shortened to Polka Tulk, and then eventually became Earth, and then eventually became Black Sabbath after the band continuously got confused with another band that was called Earth.
You know what's funny about this? I just have to bring this up, and it just struck me. This is Spinal Tap is makes fun of this beautifully. By the way, if you haven't seen This is Spinal Tap, you have to. I mean, This is Spinal Tap is not only one of the best mockumentary of all time, it's one of the best comedies of all time, but they do a whole riff on this about how there's someone already named this band, so we were going to call ourselves the New Originals, but and it's just like this idea that bands change names and try to transform so early in their lifespan. And also the Stonehenge on one of 1983 Black Sabbath album, there's a song called Stonehenge, which, if I understand correctly, inspired the Stonehenge bit in This is Spinal Tap. So Black Sabbath are actually lampooned wonderfully in that.
Yeah, we will definitely be getting to the kind of Spinal Tap influence later on. Yeah, so Earth, who were not interested in being confused with another band called Earth, and possibly later on to be confused with Manfred Mann's Earth Band, took the name Black Sabbath after a 1963 horror film directed by Mario Bava, starring Boris Karloff. I've actually seen that movie. If you watch the movie, it doesn't seem like it's really worthy of having a band named after it, but it does have Boris Karloff, which is great. Not only did they take the name Black Sabbath after that movie, they were inspired to create music or create the musical equivalent of horror movies through the discovery of a kind of musical, I guess you'd say, device called a tritone, which is often known as the Devil's Interval, which consists of like 3 whole notes played one after the other. So the name Black Sabbath, the discovery of the Devil's Interval, and lyricist Geezer Butler's interest in the supernatural and the occult, which was kind of birthed from a Catholic upbringing, got the band interested and focused on kind of creating music that didn't really sound like the flower power or the hippie kind of music that was going on at the time. They wanted to not only be darker, they wanted to have their own identity in that way. In retrospect, it was a very good decision because that darker attitude, that desire for darker music is what eventually helped to spawn an entire genre of music. Once they became Black Sabbath, they were eventually signed to a label. They appeared on John Peel's Top Gear radio show in 1969, and it wasn't too long after that that they put out their first record, a couple months, at least a year after that, on Friday the 13th, February 1970. A fairly good album commercially, reached number 8 in the UK albums charts and reached number 23 on the Billboard 200, where it stayed there for over a year. Great start commercially, but it kind of started a trend that we would see later on in their career of people just really disliking Black Sabbath critically. The famous music critic Lester Bangs described it in a Rolling Stone review as discordant jams with bass and guitar reeling like velocitized speed freaks all over each other's musical perimeters, yet never quite finding sync, which apparently to him was a bad thing. To me, it sounds pretty awesome, actually. And we'll get to talking about that album in particular later on. 4 months after Black Sabbath, the first, came out, they started work on their second album. And we've talked before about the work rate of some bands, but Black Sabbath, as you'll find, was very, very kind of prolific in their early years. You already released an album, 4 months later, you're going to work on your second album. That second album, which was eventually named Paranoid, although it was originally going to be called War Pigs, is probably their most famous album. Not only does it feature the hit song Paranoid, which was actually a hit for the band, I believe one of their only hits, it was taking that sound they discovered on their first album and honing it and refining it. And if you actually listen to that album, it is packed with great stuff. Not only Paranoid, you have Iron Man, which I've noted before was an amazing and influential song for me, War Pigs. Just to have those 3 songs, which have kind of drifted into the cultural consciousness so firmly, it is pretty astounding. This is an album that sold 4 million copies in the U.S. when it was released, with no radio airplay, which back in the day really was an important thing. Nowadays, you just drop something on Spotify, you drop it on SoundCloud, and there you go. But back in the day, if your stuff didn't play on the radio, people didn't hear about it. So to see that kind of grassroots movement get this band's stuff out there, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about those early albums. They're so very important to Black Sabbath. They are the legacy of Black Sabbath. I think when you look at sort of the discography, that beginning period there, Black Sabbath, Paranoid, Master of Reality, I think those are the big three. They're all done, within a year and a half period? It's amazing to me that they were able to do that. And I think that is really sort of the foundational period. I mean, I'm sure you're going to go on and talk a little bit about Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage and where they sort of went from there. And those are still considered good albums. But those first three albums are just considered lights out, the foundation of heavy metal, and some of the most important records in rock and roll.
Yes, just 6 months after the U.S. release of Paranoid, production was finished and the band released their third album, Master of Reality, which reached the top 10 in the US and the UK and was certified gold in less than 2 months. Remember, this is a band that could not get airplay in the US, was being lambasted, and they still got gold in which is, I can't remember what the exact amount for being certified gold is. I think it's 500,000 copies.
I think it's 500,000. I think you're right. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob, was Master of Reality the first Black Sabbath album to get mediocre or even positive reviews?
We
might have to wait till Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath for that one.
Yeah, I believe. I mean, you just look at the kind of reviews. It's pretty much nothing positive. Some things to note about Master of Reality. Personally, I think it's, of the four, I think it's probably the strongest record in terms of songs. That's just my personal opinion. It's the first album that featured Black Sabbath doing acoustic numbers, which is pretty interesting. It's also the first Sabbath album to feature down tuning. Prior to the band forming, guitarist Tony Iommi, and some of you might already know this, got into an accident during his job at a metalworking factory where he got the tips of his fingers crushed in a metal press, completely chopping them off the tips of his fingers, which were the fingers that he needed to play the notes on his guitar. A devastating accident, to be sure. But after being introduced to the work of Django Reinhardt, Tony Iommi invented a kind of finger cap out of thimbles and such that allowed him to grasp the strings and hold them down. Because of the difficulty in playing guitar that way, he was forced to detune the guitar and tune it lower in order to really be able to play effectively. And that is a major reason why Master of Reality is such an amazingly heavy, dark album, because it had to be. Yeah, Master of Reality, great album. Lester Bangs referred to the closing song, Children of the Grave, as naive, simplistic, repetitive, absolute dog roll. But in the tradition of rock and roll, the only criterion is excitement, and Black Sabbath's got it. So, yeah, it's shit, but at least they're playing it with enthusiasm. But following a quick break, or a short break, I should say, after the Master of Reality World Tour, the band went into the studio at a place called the Record Plant in LA to create Volume 4. A great album, but it is the first step in what I believe you could call the band's ultimate dissolution. The recording process was kind of plagued with problems. Music just wasn't coming. Bill Ward famously almost was fired from the band when he couldn't get a drum part correctly. And most importantly, the substance abuse, which had started right when the band was getting its start, was kind of seeping into the creative process. There's a song on the album, in fact, called Snowblind, which is a direct reference to the amount of cocaine that was being used during that release. Otherwise, it's an album that kind of saw the band experimenting a little bit more musically, kind of trying to diversify their sound. And it's an album that features one of the band's most famous songs, Changes, which I believe has been covered by a whole slew of people. The one that comes to mind right now is Charles Bradley did a amazing cover of it. This as well was an album that did incredibly well commercially, but was frowned upon critically. So deals with kind of the first 4 Black Sabbath albums. And before we kind of get a little bit more into the history, I wanted to ask you something, Beeves, because we were talking about this prior to the recording. Black Sabbath's history not only as a band, but as the progenitor of heavy metal music. And obviously, Black Sabbath wasn't the only band who was kind of doing heavier stuff. There was bands like Led Zeppelin, obviously, and Cream, and then a little bit later, bands like Uriah Heep and Deep Purple. I'm just wondering your opinion, Beeves, on what was it about music at the time that you think kind of contributed to heavy metal? What was it? What were the kind of building blocks, in your opinion, of what was to come?
Yeah, I think that sort of blues rock that you talked about, the Led Zeppelins, the Cream, the Who, that was huge in sort of the sound and where sound was headed. But I think, I think the other thing too, and it certainly seems like in the case of Black Sabbath, what you have is a reaction against the Flower Children, against, peace, love, and hippies. It seems to me some people are born contrarians, and I like to consider myself one of them. When some people zig, other people just inherently zag, because it's just true that whatever is popular, there will be an undercurrent that will hate it and fight against it. So I don't know the degree to which it's true that flower power and that whole hippie movement and peace, love, and everything else sort of contributed to the rise of Black Sabbath. But, I think it's important. That has to be a foundation there to rebel against in a way. And so I think as much as we talk about influencers like Cream and Led Zeppelin and those other like blues rock, classic, what we can now consider classic rock and roll sound, Jimi Hendrix, you got to have both, right? You got to have the influence and you got to have something to rebel against. And that's sort of where you get heavy metal in my eyes. Would you agree with that, or your own thoughts there?
Definitely think that it was not only a kind of combination of, well, we're seeing what Led Zeppelin is doing. We're seeing where the kind of technology is leading it so that you can make things louder and louder. I think not only was it kind of conscious one-up attempt from Led Zeppelin and groups like that to kind of make louder music, but I also think it was kind of a cultural reaction as well, is that by 1970, the flower power movement was done with. Now we were fully into the Vietnam War. You didn't really trust the government anymore. Stuff was just getting bad. And it reflects in the music as well. Is that another thing that's kind of come up later. I mentioned way back when the band was getting started that they were signed, well, I don't believe I mentioned it specifically, but they were signed to Philips Records, which eventually translated into a label known as Vertigo Records, which was a progressive rock label. And we'll probably note it later on, is how hand-in-hand progressive rock and metal were, especially in those early days. There was pretty much no distinction, really. I mean, Black Sabbath's on a progressive rock label. Presumably bands like Jethro Tull and Genesis would be on progressive rock labels too. So there's a definite sectioning off, I think, of metal music into musical experimentation, and in some ways just getting heavier, I guess, was progressive in its own way. Getting back into the history, the recording issues that were found in Volume 4 were still present by the time the band went to work on its next album. Months and months of kind of just horrible work in LA, just not being able to create anything. And it wasn't until that they rented a castle in the Forest of Dean, they finally started getting some major work done, which eventually kind of became Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Yet another album that kind of continued a diversification of the Sabbath sound. I think most prevalently, the inclusion of Rick Wakeman, former keyboardist for Yes, into the record kind of speaks to where the band was at on that period. And for once, it was a rousing success. Rolling Stone called the album an extraordinarily gripping affair, and nothing less than a complete success. The album was the 5th consecutive platinum selling album in the U.S., reached 4 on the charts, and number 11 in the U.S., a masterpiece essential to any heavy metal collection, while also displaying a newfound sense of finesse and maturity.
That's important to point out. I want to tell you, too, that, I've been listening to piecemeal bits and bits of Black Sabbath. I found Sabbath Bloody Sabbath to be one that I like quite a bit. I found the track, and it's a very popular one, Killing Yourself to Live, to be one that I really enjoyed. And you know what? I found myself listening to it and thinking, I'd really love to... I wish Nirvana would have covered this. Because there's something about that song, even the name of the song, just Kurt Cobain saying that I just in my head, too, there's a bass part in there that Novoselic could have really played really well. But Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, too, and one of the things that fascinates me about any band, especially one that has such a legacy like Black Sabbath, is their album covers and what their album covers look like and how they change. And Sabbath Bloody Sabbath's album cover is metal as hell. I mean, it is dark, and I don't know enough of the history of album art to be able to tell you trends and whatnot, but in 1973, this kind of weird, very skull-obsessed, sort of dark, blood red and yellow, I mean, just imposing album cover had to have been years ahead of its time. There's no way in hell you would think this was in 73. And it's so fascinating. And it's a departure from their previous album covers that were sort of dark and scary. But this one is really, imposing to me. And I just want to point that out here. I think Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is a really good album. It's an interesting... I think it's one of their better mid-life albums, if not their best mid-life album, so to speak.
And great point. After the release of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, the band did some touring, obviously. They performed at the California Jam Festival in Ontario, California. 1975, they began work on their 6th album, which was intended as a decisive vision to differ the sound from Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Tony Iommi says, "We could have continued and gone on, getting more technical, using orchestras and everything else, which we didn't particularly want to. We took a look at ourselves and we wanted to do a rock album. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath wasn't a rock album, really. It was produced and released on 1975, July. Another sterling success, critically, says here, Rolling Stone mentioned that Sabotage is not only Black Sabbath's best record since Paranoid, it might be their best ever. Later reviews did mention that the band was starting to fall apart at this time. The kind of special sauce that kind of held this sandwich together was beginning to sour. And Sabotage is really kind of take a look at the history, is kind of the last great Sabbath album with Ozzy Osbourne. Had some favorite songs like Hole in the Sky and Symptom of the Universe. As Sabotage, even though you kind of saw the holes in the cloth starting to form, it was still, for the time, a great success, critically and commercially. After some touring, in which they actually had Kiss open for them, and Kiss was a very early band at this point in time, which is pretty interesting. The band started work on their next album on June 1976. Once again, they tried to expand their sounds by including keyboards and such. But it is during the recording of this album, which would eventually be known as Technical Ecstasy, that Ozzy Osbourne really starts to become disillusioned with the music-making process. He was despondent about the idea of making music. He was getting more and more deeply into substance abuse, and subsequently the recording of the album was muddled. Despite this musical experimentation, it was just it was very rough. At one point, I believe after the release of this album, Osbourne quit the band for a while and was briefly replaced with a man named Dave Walker, who was a member of Fleetwood Mac and Savoy Brown. Eventually, Ozzy Osbourne came back to the band, but because he would refuse to perform any of the material that the band had written with Dave Walker, the next album, Never Say Die, was subsequently rushed and contained less than stellar material. Although the singles of that album, Never Say Die and Hard Road, cracked the top 40 in the UK, it was a hellish experience. During the Never Say Die tour in May of 1978, the reviewers called Black Sabbath's performance tired and uninspired, a stark contrast to the youthful performance of their openers, Van Halen, who are touring the world for the first time.
If I may interject here, I want to talk a little bit about Technical Ecstasy, which I found to be quite different. You had mentioned Sabotage is sort of the change to a more classic sound, or a more hard rock sound and less metal. Technical Ecstasy follows that through, and it is interesting, to say the least. I don't think it's necessarily good, but it is interesting. The cover to this, too, is just mind-blowing to me. You should definitely see the cover of Technical Ecstasy, because it's two robots that look like they're making love in some weird way. It's absurd. I hate it so much that I kind of like it. The history of Black Sabbath's album covers itself is endlessly fascinating. Never Say Die, 1978, has two, it looks like pilots, like air fighter pilots on the cover, and it looks very, I don't know, Black Crows-ish. I don't even know where to begin with it, but it doesn't even, you compare something like that to 1973's Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and it's like, how is this even the same band? And maybe at that point they really weren't, but it's just fascinating, sort of the difference, the changes that they went through in the span of 8 years.
Yeah, after that tour with Van Halen, that's an interesting thing to note, that Black Sabbath kind of helped the careers of both Kiss and Van Halen. Ozzy Osbourne's substance abuse problems were so severe that Tony Iommi eventually fired him from the group. It was too bad. Osbourne was a mess. He wouldn't work on material, so they just had to get rid of him. And Sharon Arden, who was the daughter of Black Sabbath's manager, Don Arden, suggested the former vocalist for Rainbow, Ronnie James Dio, to replace Osbourne in the group. And that leads us into kind of the second, I guess you'd say, major phase of Black Sabbath's history. We dealt with the Ozzy Osbourne years, and now we're going into the Ronnie James Dio year. And the album that eventually came out of this pairing, the first album, Heaven and Hell, is an album totally unlike the Black Sabbath albums that have come before it. There's an energy to it. There's a kind of vitality that was missing in Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy. Really, there's a different sound, because Ronnie James Dio and Ozzy Osbourne are very different. Where Ozzy Osbourne would sing along with the rhythm, Ronnie James Dio would sing across the rhythm, which really kind of opened up their sound. And this kind of gets into the kind of second part of the question that I posed earlier. How different is the sensibilities of rock music when it is in the late 60s, early 70s, as opposed to metal music? By the time Heaven and Hell has come out, metal is its own genre. It's got its own identity. And I'm wondering, I believe we talked a little bit about this prior to recording, what are like the characteristics of metal music at this time, do you think, Beaves? What's really why do you think it is that metal has suddenly become not only its own genre, but really defines the music of the 1980s, at least the early 1980s?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe it is that I talked about earlier that Black Sabbath was a reaction to the happier, sunnier, hippier side. I think maybe in just the popular consciousness, it took a while for that to spill over into pop success, for that sound to really resonate with other people. I think as a reaction to sort of the Vietnam War and to everything else, the 70s into the 80s, that sound, I think the guitar, the way it was able to come through clearly, I think it was just sort of a natural progression of what people had become accustomed to. And it fit nicely in there, too. I think, too, guitar riffs just would hit well with the mainstream if they're really sharp and they're very melodic. And metal is certainly capable of doing that. So I think you sort of see that change. To me, it's fascinating because in the 70s, with Black Sabbath, with Uriah Heep with Deep Purple, we have metal in its infancy. And then in the 80s, it becomes very pop, and you have hair metal, and you have the lyrics are pushed to the front, and the guitar is really brought out. It's made really sharp, and so it's really just guitar solos and vocals. People aren't really too concerned about drums or bass, at least I believe. In the 90s, it evolves even more, and we get into technical metal and death metal and bands like Opeth. And then even into today, we get into bands which have really a mixed legacy critically and in certain circles, like Deaf Heaven, whom I happen to really like and think that they combine this, they're a really weird combination of like shoegaze and death metal, and they're fascinating to me, and I really enjoy them quite a bit. That's the thing. Metal has really changed, and there's really a lot of subgenres to metal. And metal in that way is a perfect microcosm of rock and roll. There's so many different genres of rock and roll, so many different sounds. And metal itself is a perfect microcosm of that, because it can go in so many different wonderful directions. It's hard to say really what caused metal to go mainstream in the 80s, but it's really beautiful and really wonderful in a way that metal continues to branch out and develop and go in different directions that one might not expect.
I don't know. I mentioned kind of the connection between heavy metal, early heavy metal, and progressive rock. And I think part of the reason why metal kind of made the transition to mainstream in a lot of ways is, again, a progression of technology. And also the fact that metal took so easily to progressive rock's desire and a need for spectacle.
That's a great way to put it. I think, too, what you said about technology, I think, is really true, because metal, and maybe it's because Black Sabbath was obviously so open to it, but metal was so open to influence. It was so open to other instruments. It was so open to noodling, to anything anybody wanted to throw against the wall and see what would stick.
Yeah, and I think that's really the two main schools of thought that not only kind of made metal popular, I think it's really what defined how metal was explored in the 80s going on. This desire for sound and this progressive rock desire for musical complexity and musical composition and diversification, which is why you saw heavy rock-based stuff like thrash metal get its start in the 80s with bands like Metallica and Megadeth and such like that. And then you had the guitar gods, I guess you'd call them, Youngway Malmsteen or Dave Satriani, kind of these people who treat the guitar as a classical, or electric guitar at least, as a classical compositional instrument. By the 1980s, metal has not only become a genre, it has become a genre, it's much like rock and roll. You had your Elvis Presleys and you had your Chuck Berrys, but eventually, once rock moved on from being the devil's music and started becoming pop music, suddenly you started seeing variations on a theme. You saw the Beatles come out, and you saw the Rolling Stones come out. And from the groups like the Rolling Stones, you saw bands like Cream, which eventually led into Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. Since metal had a little bit of a head start, I guess, once metal became mainstream, that was when you started seeing kind of experimentation with it.
I don't want to jump the gun here. I don't want to jump in on the discography too much here, but I just have to say, Heaven and Hell is often regarded as a very, very good Black Sabbath album. But I feel like after Heaven and Hell, when you talk about the Ronnie James Dio era, it seems to me Black Sabbath is really just, maybe this is too mean, they're just imitating different artists on each album. Like Born Again sounds to me like a bad Alice Cooper impersonation, and 1992, Dehumanizer sounds, and even the cover of the album look like a bad Iron Maiden impersonation. After 1980, after Heaven and Hell, again, we talk about these albums, they're just going through the motions. Feels like they're a step behind.
Yeah, Heaven and Hell was a great success, and the Dio-led version of the group was able to release one more album, Mob Rules, which I really love the title track on that album, but was a kind of return to form in that it was well received by fans, but the critics didn't love it. One thing I really like that Rolling Stone mentioned that The album received 1 star, saying Mob Rules finds the band as dull-witted and flatulent as ever. After Mob Rules, really after an album called Live Evil, Dio quit the band, and this kind of followed a theme as Bill Ward had also left the band earlier, as citing substance abuse problems, much like Ozzy Osbourne. Departure of Ronnie James Dio speaks to a very long decline that the band went over. Alan mentioned Born Again. That album, which was done by a Black Sabbath that only featured Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler as original members, as well as Ian Gillan of Deep Purple as vocalist, and Bill Ward, who returned clean and sober on drums. And that album was very poorly received. Mentions that the album was dreadful, lazy style, and humorous lyrics were completely incompatible with the Lords of Doom and Gloom. Just a horrible experience. And the subsequent tour was also fraught with problems, including a botched attempt at stagecraft with a Stonehenge set, which was originally supposed to be 15 feet, but the person wrote it down as 15 meters, and so the Stonehenge set was 45 feet tall, and thus was unable to be placed on the stage. This would later be parodied in the popular Christopher Guest, Rob Reiner film, This is Spinal Tap, with their tiny Stonehenge set with a dwarf that threatened to crush it. But Ian Gillan left after the disastrous Born Again tour, and that was really a point where Tony Iommi was kind of left as the sole member of the group. Geezer Butler left, I think for good reason. He didn't really like where the band was going before Ian Gillan kind of came in, and Ian Gillan being there didn't really do well at all. So Tony Iommi tried to go his own way as a kind of solo star, but unfortunately, during the recording of his solo album, Seventh Star, Warner Brothers kind of forced him to put the Black Sabbath name on it, which led to another kind of critically panned and commercially panned album. Although it did feature another Deep Purple member, Glenn Hughes, on vocals. Very interesting how closely together Deep Purple and Black Sabbath were. Into the late 80s, Tony Iommi kind of tried to continue Black Sabbath as a hodgepodge of different musicians he picked up. Tony Martin kind of came in as a vocalist. Neil Murray came in as a bassist. And really, this period of history kind of reads as a constant series of down notes. I mean, it starts off with Black Sabbath accepting a deal to play 6 shows in South Africa during apartheid. After that, they released an album called The Eternal Idol, which was ignored mostly, although people did note some things about it, like Martin did a good job on vocals and had some of Iommi's heaviest riffs in years. But because of that whole apartheid thing, touring kind of went nowhere. And several tours, in fact, in the following years were canceled because of low ticket sales, which is kind of crazy to think about, that a band that had, by like 1973, 5 platinum-selling albums had to cancel tours because they couldn't sell enough tickets. That is at least crazy to me. In 1989, Black Sabbath released Headless Cross, which was actually, although ignored by reviewers at the time, was eventually kind of credited as the finest non-Ozzy or Dio Black Sabbath album was made. Featured Brian May of Queen on guitar, Neil Murray of Whitesnake, but again, bad touring. Although it is interesting to note that Black Sabbath was one of the first bands to tour Russia after Mikhail Gorbachev kind of opened the Soviet Union up. Following the disastrous late 80s, we move on into the 1990s, which saw actually the band returning to the Dio lineup, specifically the Mob Rules lineup. Ronnie James Dio joined Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, and Vinny Appice on drums. Dehumanizer was one of the better albums by Black Sabbath during this period. It had a top 40 radio rock single called TV Crimes. Album peaked at number 4 on the Billboard 200. Had a song featured in Wayne's World, which I believe is the highest honor you can have. And it was just a kind of return to form for people who were glad to see a familiar form of the band. But that kind of fell apart once Ozzy Osbourne came back into the picture. And once Ozzy wanted the band to kind of perform with him during one of his retirement concerts, Dio got pissed about it, and he left the band. So that short moment of success led right back into basically nothing. Into the late 90s, we see the band releasing their album Cross Purposes, which received mixed reviews, and even had Blender magazine calling Soundgarden's album Super Unknown a far better Sabbath album than this By the Numbers Potboiler. It had a song co-written by Eddie Van Halen that couldn't be labeled as co-written by Eddie Van Halen. Later on, we saw, after Cross Purposes, Geezer Butler leaves the band again to form his own side project, and even writing a song attacking Tony Iommi for kind of continuing the band for so long without it having the original members. Iommi continued on with an album called Forbidden, so on and so forth. Tony Iommi kind of struggles along for a bit until we finally get to a period of time when the original group has reformed. They perform at Ozfest together. They release a single of their song Iron Man, which ended up getting their first Grammy Award in history, Best Metal Performance in 2000. Ozzy Osbourne started up his reality TV show, The Osbournes, which was a huge hit. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006. We saw a return of the Dio version of the group after a release of a compilation called Black Sabbath, The Dio Years, eventually led to kind of the last stage with release of the album called 13.
Yeah, I think it's a nice return to form, to be honest with you. I was surprised. I really think it finds inspiration in the early Black Sabbath sound, and I think it is sort of the right way for them to bid farewell. I think it gives people one last shot at the sound of Black Sabbath, and they try to recapture that magic. I don't know how really successful they are, not being a hardcore fan and having not given it more than a listen, but it really does sound like that classic Black Sabbath. I think Rick Rubin does a really good job of bringing to the fore the sound. The instruments come through very clearly as the classical Rick Rubin. Of course, the criticism with any Rick Rubin produced album is that it's recorded at such a high volume that for audiophiles, the reproduction is too compressed. To be honest with you, I'm not enough of an audiophile to really notice, to put that out there. But I think this is a pretty decent little album. I think God is Dead was the lead single off of it, if I'm not mistaken. I just think it's a nice little return to form for the band and a really nice way to bow out.
Yeah, kind of a weird thing because this album comes out at we talked about kind of the beginnings of heavy metal and kind of its birth from hard rock. We talked a little bit about it in the 80s when it became a mainstream kind of sound and really kind of led the way for experimentation. And now in 2013, we're looking at metal's at a kind of strange place because the idea of radio-friendly metal music has kind of gone out the window. There's still great bands like Opeth and Porcupine Tree and Dream Theater and stuff like that, but it kind of seems like metal has, after being there so long in the spotlight through hair metal of the 1980s and thrash metal of the late 80s into kind of new metal of the 90s and early 2000s, they kind of pushed themselves so far into particular niches that they're almost back into obscurity. Metal has kind of become such a specific genre that it's not really exclusive anymore.
That's sort of the irony, isn't it? That you create something to escape the bland normality of everyone else until it becomes the bland normality. I think, wow, that's very sad in a way, but I don't know. I think there's a large degree to which that's true. Yeah, and it's funny. Black Sabbath eventually went full circle, which is just the perfect analogy for music and metal music in general. I think that's where you evolve and you go to all these different places, and then by the end you come back to where you were to begin with.
It is definitely a wild ride. to just kind of look at. So all that history aside, all the amazing Spinal Tap references and all this other stuff, let's get down to the album proper, Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath's eponymous 1970 release, Black Sabbath. According to legend, recorded in one day, in one take as well. It was performed live on October 16th, 1969. Only had a little bit of post-production work done, a couple guitar doublings and stuff like that. And appropriately enough for Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath, the first track on Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath is Black Sabbath. Not only is this the kind of introduction of the Devil's Interval, but I mentioned this before, this track is where heavy metal was birthed from. I think it's a crystallization of what made this band worth following in 1970. I think it's probably the most fully realized track on the album as well. After a little bit of Rainstorm, you have that huge guitar by Tony Iommi, the footsteps of an angry giant that kind of come down as Ozzy Osbourne tells the audience about this dark figure that he's hounding him that eventually is revealed to be Satan. And say what you will about Ozzy Osbourne as a vocalist, that Dio was better technically speaking. Ozzy Osbourne puts on such an amazing performance on this song. Feeling of fear and paranoia that you get from it is amazing.
I just love the, oh no, please God help me.
And then that,
like, oh God, that is, yeah, that's truly, this is, if you had to pick one track that is the perfect summation, you'd said this, Jacob, and it's totally true, of what Black Sabbath is and should be remembered for, and it's perfect. It is a perfect song for what it tries to do. It's perfect.
Yeah, and once the speed starts to kick in, you can definitely tell where metal got its start from. The way that Tony Iommi kind of does that sharp finger picking when it speeds up is metal to me, and it is an amazing track. Moving on to track number 2, and we're already almost done with the album, folks.
No, I just, like, Jacob, let's just reflect on this a second. I just want to put this forward. This track, the first track from the debut album, creates a whole new genre, basically. It is, in my opinion, and there are people here who will get into arguments about, well, yeah, but for all intents and purposes, and this is I just love this track. I mean, I think this is the end all and be all if you want to look at metal. This is such the perfect summation of it. I can't believe that, having never heard this album previous to when we discussed we were going to do it, and having heard the song to lead it off, I was shocked at how this opens up because it's just so perfect. I just love it. I think it's absolutely fundamentally wonderful. The rest of this album is really good in bits and pieces that are like truly metal. Some of this also strikes me as very much like heavy rock. A lot of like The Wizard strikes me as heavy rock, and we'll get to that and whatnot. But it's just, this song is metal encompassed.
Yeah, I believe Rob Halford of Judas Priest called Black Sabbath the most evilest song ever written. So we move on to track number 2, The Wizard, which I believe was written about Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. Geezer Butler was a big fan, not only occultist subjects, but also J.R. Tolkien. This song is, for one, it's a very kind of great hard rocking song. Reminds me a lot of Led Zeppelin's Black Dog. It's kind of this good kind of pounding hard rock stuff. What's also interesting about this track is that it's like the only Black Sabbath song that I can think of that has ever featured a harmonica.
Yeah, and that comes across really well. I like how it sounds here, too. It's interesting. When I think about the subject matter, like The Wizard and this sort of like D&D sort of Tolkien kind of style, I think of Rush for whatever reason, and I think that Rush, you can kind of hear that kind of similar sound here as well. So
yeah, I believe this one was one of the earlier Black Sabbath tracks that I listened to, and I still love it to this day. It just makes me want to headbang. There's just so much kind of great energy behind it.
Yeah, to me, I just sort of noticed the sort of tone change from the track Black Sabbath to The Wizard. The Wizard's still a really good song. It's just, it's not the same tone. This isn't like doom. This isn't evil. So
And the Wizard, I think, is like the first indication that, no, you're not hearing a complete reinvention of the musical wheel. Black Sabbath was still kind of its time in a lot of ways. Moving on from that, we come into the first of our medleys. I believe it doesn't really mention this in the kind of European release of this album, which, by the way, features a song that's not on the North American release, which is what Alan and I listened to, had a cover of the Crow song Evil Woman, which is notable just for the fact that it's one of the first songs Black Sabbath recorded, and it didn't do that well as a single. Pop medley here, at least in North American editions of the album, is referred to as Wasp, Behind the Wall of Sleep, Basically, and NIB. But really, it's the two songs are Behind the Wall of Sleep and NIB, with the other two tracks kind of being intros to those two songs. Behind the Wall of Sleep, which is a reference to a H.P. Lovecraft story, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, I believe, it's a pretty good hard-rocking song, actually. It kind of gets into the heart of what makes these songs good, which is like a great kind of groove to it and a really kind of great heaviness to it. Really got to thank Tony Iommi here. I think you mentioned it, Alan, when we were doing the pre-production for this, is that Tony Iommi is really kind of the star of the show in a lot of ways on this album.
I think so. I think the lyrics are actually quite good, too. Like, if you read the lyrics, or you can understand what Ozzy's saying. I think you can most of the time, but that's sort of the stereotype after the TV show. But yeah, I think just the guitar playing here is through the roof. I think by the end, to be honest with you, I'm not as keen on it. I think it's a little masturbatory by the end.
Just as a little aside, according to kind of the history of the band, the kind of musical duties during recording were kind of split into three. Geezer Butler would write the lyrics to the songs, Ozzy Osbourne would write the vocal melodies, and Tony Iommi was responsible for creating the riffs and really the kind of basis of the songs. So it really kind of speaks to Tony Iommi as a performer that he's just constantly able to pull out these amazing riffs. Not only on this album, but if you consider if that continued, that kind of three-person structure, he did it for like 7 albums, like just constantly putting out great stuff. So Behind the Wall of Sleep, pretty good track. NIB, according to history, was named after Bill Ward's beard, which kind of looked like a pencil nib. NIB and the kind of intro song, basically, is the song that made me want to play bass guitar. Just to hear that great Geezer Butler bass opening where he's just kind of rolling around the strings. And it was like nothing I had ever heard before, because it was nothing I had ever heard before. It was so heavy and it was so kind of rhythmical, where I was always used to kind of guitar-centric rock music, which is like about heaviness and about solos and everything and the speed at which you can play notes. And this was just kind of how well you could create a rhythm. And it was kind of extraordinary to me. NIB is a very kind of basic song. The riff isn't that complex. It's just da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. It's almost like a Louie Louie in a way. Just kind of very basic kind of structure. Song about Lucifer falling in love with a woman and trying to take him back to hell. Or according to Geezer Butler, falling in love with a woman who made him a better man. But it does kind of add fire to the idea of Black Sabbath being a satanic or occult band when you're singing about Satan trying to tempt a woman. They were trying to make music the musical equivalent of horror films, and it kind of worked. Really love NIB. I love the crunchy guitar that Tony Iommi has on this track. And it's just, I've always really loved it. Track number 4, we have Wicked World, which, if the Wizard reminded me of Black Dog from Led Zeppelin, Wicked World reminds me a lot of Cream, or a song by Cream, actually. This high-paced, upbeat, almost jazzy kind of guitar and drum sequence that is kind of interspersed with big, heavy, slow rock movements. Big lumbering guitar tone. And not actually a song that I listened to all that much prior to this. And although it's good, I don't really, honestly, these last two tracks often don't come up in my memory all that often. It's a good track. Kind of deals with a similar thing in Black Sabbath songs, telling you about how much the world sucks.
I agree with a large part of what you said. It sounds like Cream or some other sort of heavy rock band at the time. On the next little melody that we have that come together, A Bit of Finger, Sleeping Village, and Warning. I really like A Bit of Finger, and I've always considered that to be some sort of like Tony Iommi tribute. And I don't know if it is or if it isn't, but just I always think about Iommi when I think about the title. I just really like it. I like the sort of the sound, the mood that it creates. It's very brief, but I like it a lot.
Yeah, this last song is another suite or medley track split between A Bit of Finger, Sleeping Village, and Warning, which was actually a cover song a cover of a song by Ainsley Dunbar, who was a drummer who you might not recognize, but he performed with a lot of kind of those early electric blues bands that came out of Britain in the 60s, like John Mayall and the Blues Breakers and stuff like that. Sleeping Bag, I kind of like. It's a much, much slower song than what you hear on the rest of the record. Kind of a gloomy version of a Led Zeppelin song. And Warning is also very good, actually. I think this is another track where Tony Iommi's the guitar is heavily emphasized and kind of focused because he just blitzes through stuff in these last couple minutes. You got that doubling guitar, and he's just wailing on it. I think the main problem is this last track, if you're kind of listening to the album front to back, is over 14 minutes long. And I think by like the 7th or 8th minute, which is when Warning kicks in, I'm kind of tired of the album. It's like it's good stuff. I loved every track pretty much, but like I don't know, there's something about like tracks that kind of last that long.
Yeah, that was my point. It's a little, for me, it's a little masturbatory by the end there. And look, I have no doubt in Iommi's ability and everything else. It just does seem to carry on a bit too long, doesn't it?
It's weird because the album is only like 5 tracks long, and yet one of the tracks is like 14 minutes long, and that for some reason feels too long. Like it feels like too much time is being taken up. But the stuff in there is very good. Classic prog rock closer. You wouldn't be surprised that Black Sabbath was on a progressive rock label after hearing the final track here. And that does it for Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath. An album that maybe we didn't give enough focus on in comparison to the history of the group. But I think that works two ways, because what I really love about this album is how simple it is. Ozzy Osbourne is kind of a very simple vocalist. He sings with the rhythm. The things he says are very clear. He doesn't really try to experiment too far in his vocals. He's very simple in that way. Like the songs themselves lend themselves well to kind of simple head banging, stuff like that. It's just a very well-performed, tight set of songs, which was recorded live, so you know that it was, in a lot of ways, exactly as it was on paper. It was that tight because that's how they performed it. I've listened to this album about 4 or 5 times now in the past week, and I could probably listen to it 4 or 5 because I just love Black Sabbath. I love this album. I hope all you people out there love Black Sabbath too. What are your thoughts as we're kind of winding down here, Beeves?
Well, let me explain what I learned today in class. No, I learned a lot about the history of the band. I think it's fascinating. It is to be very nice, it's a mess. After like 1980, it is an utter stone cold mess. But I think there's a lot here. There's a lot of great Black Sabbath stuff out there. I think if you understand that what they're doing, they're creating a sound with a wink and a nod, and it's supposed to be this playfully dark kind of thing. There's so many great songs that, you really should check out at least the title track. The title and, the title track from the eponymous release of Black Sabbath. The history of rock and roll owes a debt to that song that cannot be put into words. I enjoyed really learning about the history and seeing how they've changed. I think there's a lot to love about Black Sabbath. Those first 3 albums are great. And And, today we covered a lot of ground. We talked about a lot of that history, and I'm glad we got to do that.
Yeah. You think of how many bands that exist in the world now that might not have existed or existed in kind of different forms had it not been for this one album to kind of light the way and say, making songs about the devil and demons and death and all this stuff is fine. It's actually kind of cool. Yeah, that does it for the Black Sabbath episode. Hope you had fun. Next week, covering an album and band that Alan really loves. And it's an album that I've known about for years and years and yet have never explored until now. It's Neutral Milk Hotel's In an Airplane Over the Sea, that 1998 classic that has inspired so many hipsters. Yeah, that should also be a great episode. My name is Jacob Slater. With me, as always, is Alan Beavers. And we'll see you next time, folks.